It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I heard the scream. Not just any scream, the kind that tears through your chest and stops your heart cold. I dropped the garden shears and sprinted across the yard, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. And then I saw her, my little girl, curled in a pit nearly 6 feet deep, crying, her tiny hands clutching her leg twisted at a sickening angle. Dirt was packed around her, rocks scattered like a trap had been set. I jumped in without thinking, held her close, trying to keep calm as her tears soaked through my shirt. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I looked up, and there stood Karen, HOA board member, self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, and the woman who had made our lives hell for months. She crossed her arms and said, "Maybe if your daughter watched where she was going, she wouldn't have fallen in." My hands were shaking, part from rage, part from disbelief. She had dug that pit. I had seen her marking the ground days ago, said it was for a garden extension. But now, with my disabled daughter lying in agony at the bottom of it, she was blaming her. That's when I realized this wasn't just about HOA rules or noise complaints. This woman had declared war on us. And the worst part? The HOA backed her, called it an unfortunate accident, told me I was being dramatic. But what they didn't know, what Karen didn't know, was who I really am. You see, I've spent the last 20 years exposing corruption, unearthing lies, and bringing down people who thought they were untouchable. I let it go when she left fake notices on our door. I let it go when she shouted at my daughter for picking flowers. But this was intentional harm. And when you go after my child, you don't get to walk away. She thought she'd buried her secret in that pit. But I was about to dig up everything and make her regret ever crossing our family. ChatGPT said, "My name is Daniel Monroe, and I've lived a quiet, disciplined life most of my adult years. I'm a data analyst by profession, one of those people who can stare at thousands of lines of numbers and make sense of them. But more importantly, I'm a father. That's the title I wear with the most pride, and the one that matters more than any degree or career. My wife, Julia, and I moved into our lakeside neighborhood 2 years ago, chasing a slower life after years in the city. We weren't looking for trouble, just a safe, clean place to raise our daughter, Maddie. She's the heart of our world, smart, curious, and tougher than most people twice her age. Maddie was born with cerebral palsy. The doctors told us she might never walk, but they didn't know Maddie. From the time she was 2, she's been fighting to do the things everyone said she couldn't. She uses a walker now, but don't let that fool you. She will climb hills, dance to music, and try to outrun squirrels if you let her. I've seen her fall more times than I can count, and each time she gets up, grits her teeth, and laughs like it was nothing. She doesn't want special treatment. She just wants to be a kid. We thought this neighborhood would be the fresh start she deserved. We found a quaint ranch-style home with a wide front yard and a swing hanging from the oak tree. It felt like something out of a storybook. The neighbors seemed quiet and reserved, which suited us just fine. But we quickly learned there was one voice that was anything but quiet. Karen Shaw, head of the HOA, president of the gardening club, and self-proclaimed keeper of the community aesthetic. At first, it was small things. A note about our lawn being a quarter-inch too long, an email about the wind chimes being too disruptive. Then it became about Maddie, complaints that her walker scuffed the sidewalk, that her toys were left unsightly on the lawn, that her therapy sessions on the porch looked unprofessional. I thought maybe she was just overzealous, maybe a little too attached to her clipboard. I didn't want conflict. I was raised to be the kind of man who solves problems with patience and dialogue, not fists or shouting. I tried reasoning with Karen. I explained Maddie's condition, offered compromises, even volunteered for the neighborhood cleanup just to keep the peace. But Karen didn't want peace, she wanted power. It became clear over time that she saw us not as neighbors, but as intruders who didn't fit her mold. Still, we held our heads high. We weren't going to let one bitter woman ruin the life we were building. Maddie made friends with a few kids on the block, and we spent weekends working in our garden or watching movies under the stars. My wife and I worked hard, paid our dues, and poured everything we had into making our house a home. And that's what made what happened all the more devastating. We didn't come to this place with drama. We didn't bring conflict to Karen's door. All we ever asked for was to be left in peace. But somehow that was too much. When I say Maddie is my world, I don't say it like a cliche. I mean, every beat of my heart moves for that little girl. I've stayed up nights researching therapy techniques, building custom braces, even learning to code just to help her with a special speech assist app. There is nothing I wouldn't do to protect her. Nothing. That's why, when I found her at the bottom of that hole, crying, bleeding, in pain, not from an accident, but from a trap someone set, something inside me broke. Not in a way that made me lash out. No, it was colder than that. Clearer. It was the moment I knew this wasn't about overgrown grass or sidewalk paint. This was personal, and it had gone too far. I'd tried to be patient, tried to be understanding, tried to be the bigger man. But now, Karen had crossed a line. She didn't just threaten my peace, she endangered my daughter's life. And the world needed to see what kind of monster hides behind HOA rules and phony smiles. They thought we were just a quiet family. Harmless. Easy targets. They were wrong. We first met Karen Shaw on our second day in the neighborhood. Julia and I were unloading the last few boxes from the U-Haul when she walked briskly across the lawn in her spotless white sneakers, clipboard in hand, and a smile that felt too tight to be real. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, standing just a few inches too close to our porch steps. "I'm Karen, head of the Homeowners Association. You must be the Monroes." She didn't wait for confirmation. Her eyes were already scanning our flower beds, then flicking to the small, welcome banner Maddie had painted that now fluttered by the mailbox. "We do have certain aesthetic standards around here. Nothing personal," she added quickly, already writing something on her clipboard. "Just want to keep everything uniform. You understand." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Every word was wrapped in false friendliness, each smile a disguise for surveillance. I nodded politely, told her we were looking forward to being part of the community. Maddie peeked out the window and waved. Karen's eyes flicked to her walker, then back to us. "Oh, how precious," she said. "So brave of you to move her here with all the hills and uneven sidewalks. I do hope that won't be a problem." We brushed it off. People say awkward things. Maybe she didn't mean it that way. But the comments continued. Subtle digs buried in smiles. "That's quite the swing you've got there. Did you clear that with the HOA first? I noticed you painted the trim eggshell, not bone. Could be an issue at the next board review." Maddie's music therapy is just wonderful, though it might be a touch loud for some of the older neighbors. We tried not to let it get to us. Every neighborhood has that neighbor, we told ourselves. We just needed to stay polite, professional, and out of her way. But Karen didn't want distance, she wanted control. The first violation notice came 3 weeks in. A printed letter with HOA letterhead in our mailbox citing yard clutter for Maddie's therapy cones, which we use twice a week. Then another for non-standard lawn decor, referring to Maddie's painted garden gnome that sat beneath our tree. Julia and I attended the next HOA meeting, thinking we could explain, maybe find common ground. Karen barely looked at us as we spoke. When we brought up Maddie's therapy needs, she gave a tight-lipped smile and said, "Of course, but rules are rules." That was Karen's favorite phrase. Rules are rules. She wielded them like weapons, using bylaws like blades. And the truth? She didn't enforce them equally. Her friend down the street had 3 flamingos in the yard and solar lights that blinked like Vegas. Not a word. But we got cited for leaving a children's chalk drawing on the sidewalk overnight. When I gently asked Karen why, she responded with a saccharine, "Well, Daniel, not everyone appreciates sidewalk art, especially when it's unbalanced. You know how kids are." It was the way she said unbalanced. Like Maddie's disability was a nuisance she had to tolerate. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about us. We were the outsiders, the ones who didn't match the neighborhood's curated image. And Karen had made it her personal mission to remind us of that. Still, I tried to stay civil. We complied where we could. I moved the cones to the garage when not in use. We painted over the garden gnome. We adjusted Maddie's therapy hours to avoid peak neighborhood foot traffic. But No matter what we did, it wasn't enough. Karen's crusade against us escalated slowly, like a kettle left to boil. First it was letters, then it was photos. Yes, she took pictures of our yard, our trash bins, even of Maddie practicing her walking drills. She said it was for evidence. I called it harassment. She began involving other board members, twisting stories, framing us as noncompliant, disruptive. A few started to believe her. Others remained silent. And when she couldn't find real violations, she made them up. One afternoon, I came home to a citation for excessive lawn watering, even though our sprinklers had been off for 2 days straight due to a broken valve. When I confronted her, she smiled and said, "Well, it looked wet when I walked by. Maybe it was condensation." Julia was furious, but I kept telling her, "Don't take the bait." That's what Karen wants. She wants a reaction she can use, a slip-up she can report. But behind my calm exterior, I was seething. The constant scrutiny, the passive-aggressive notes, the never-ending complaints. It was all exhausting. Maddie started asking why the lady next door didn't like her. She asked if she'd done something wrong. That's when the frustration turned to heartbreak, because no child should feel unwanted in their own home. Karen's control didn't stop at our property line either. She managed the community events, the gardening club, even had a say in which vendors were allowed to hang flyers on the neighborhood board. She ran the HOA like a tiny dictatorship under the guise of protecting property values. But it was never about property. It was about power. One day, she saw Maddie playing with another neighborhood child, Jamie, the son of a new family who hadn't yet felt Karen's sting. They were blowing bubbles, laughing, Maddie sitting under the shade of the oak tree. Karen approached, crouched down, and said with syrupy concern, "Sweetheart, those bubbles might make the grass slippery, and we don't want any more accidents, do we?" Jamie's mom overheard and pulled him away. From that day forward, Maddie played alone again. Every interaction with Karen became a landmine. She'd show up unannounced during family dinners to remind us about new HOA landscaping rules. She left laminated flyers on our car windshields about the dangers of non-standard holiday decorations. And once, she had the audacity to warn us that a community watch member had seen Maddie's walker near the curb and thought it was a safety hazard. When I asked who the member was, she just smiled and said, "I can't disclose sources. HOA confidentiality, you understand." At that point, I began documenting everything. Every note, every notice, every incident. Something told me we were heading toward a confrontation we couldn't avoid. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with opinions. She was a force that had convinced herself she was the last line of defense between our family and the neighborhood's integrity. But the more she pushed, the more I began to see the cracks. Neighbors avoided her eyes during walks. I'd overhear whispers at the mailbox. Some people agreed with us, but they were afraid to speak out. Karen held too much sway, and then, a week before everything came crashing down, I saw her standing at the edge of our property again, clipboard in hand, measuring tape in the other. She was studying the backyard fence line with the kind of focus that made my skin crawl. When I asked what she was doing, she looked up, smiled tight as ever, and said, "Oh, nothing, Daniel. Just thinking of ways to improve the neighborhood." She turned and walked away, and that was the last time I saw her before the pit appeared. It started with a letter folded neatly in a bright orange envelope taped to our front door like it was a summons from a universe itself. The paper was thick, almost glossy, printed in black bold font. Notice of violation, non-compliant yard structures. Underneath, in smaller text, it claimed our daughter's therapy cones, placed on the side lawn during her daily physical therapy sessions, were aesthetic obstructions inconsistent with community standards. It read like legal jargon, but it had no HOA signature, just a typed HOA enforcement team at the bottom, with no contact information. At first glance, it felt official, but something about it was off. Julia called me at work the moment she found it. "Danny, it's not even from the actual HOA board. I checked their usual headers. This feels fake." I tried to stay calm, told her I'd look into it when I got home. But inside, I already knew where it came from. Only one person in this neighborhood had both the time and the obsessive pettiness to fabricate an entire violation letter just to harass us. When I arrived, Maddie was in the living room, unusually quiet. She clutched her favorite plush rabbit, knees tucked into her chest. "Am I in trouble?" she whispered. "Because of my cones?" My heart sank. No child should feel guilty for trying to walk. "Of course not, sweetheart," I said, crouching beside her. "You haven't done a single thing wrong." But I also knew words wouldn't fix what was happening, not this time. That night, I brought the letter to my computer. A quick PDF comparison with previous legitimate HOA notices confirmed it. This one was different. The layout, the font spacing, even the watermark were all wrong. Karen had either printed it herself or coerced someone on the board to help. But the intent was clear: intimidation. I could have reported it, but to whom? Karen was the HOA president. She was the system. The next morning, I calmly removed the cones and stacked them in the garage temporarily. I needed time to think. When I stepped back outside, Karen was walking her dog along the sidewalk across the street. She paused, gave me that too sweet smile, and said, "Oh, I see you got the notice. Glad to see you're being cooperative. It's really for the best, safety and all." The way she said safety made my skin prickle. There was no concern in her tone, only triumph. I nodded and walked back inside. That was the moment I realized we weren't just dealing with an annoying neighbor, we were living under a microscope. And Karen? She wasn't going to stop until we either left or broke. A week passed. Things calmed. No new notes, no new accusations. I almost let myself believe it was over. Then the second incident hit, this time in front of the entire neighborhood. It was Saturday morning. Sunny quiet. Maddie was outside with Julia, practicing walking between two upright garden stakes with tension bands, something her physical therapist had recommended. I was trimming the hedges when Karen stormed up the sidewalk, this time with a phone in one hand and a folder in the other. "Excuse me," she snapped. "What is this?" She waved her phone at us like it was a weapon. On the screen, a photo of Maddie using the stakes, her walker parked beside her. I stepped forward calmly. "That's a private therapy aid. We're on our own lawn." "It's not about the lawn," she snapped. "It's about obstruction, visibility, aesthetics. This isn't a playground. It's a neighborhood." Julia stiffened beside me. "You're harassing a child, Karen." Karen didn't blink. "I'm enforcing rules. If we let everyone do whatever they want, what kind of neighborhood would this be?" One of the neighbors across the street, Mr. Rowe, paused while getting his mail. A younger couple walking their golden retriever slowed down to eavesdrop. Karen noticed the audience and smiled wider, shifting into performance mode. "I've submitted this to the board," she said, flipping open the folder. "There are procedures, processes. You people can't just move in and turn the place into a circus. You people—" I repeated slowly. Karen faltered for the briefest moment, then recovered. "Families who think they're exempt. We all follow the same standards. That's what keeps property values high." The irony was unbearable. Her obsession with property value masked something deeper: prejudice, fear, or maybe just a sick need for power. I looked her in the eye and said, quietly, "My daughter is not your problem. She's not a violation. And if you think I'm going to let you bully her with fake letters and public tantrums, you're very, very wrong." She opened her mouth to respond, but I turned my back on her, not out of weakness, because I knew walking away from people like her robs them of oxygen. Karen needed conflict to justify her cruelty. But later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, a car slowly drove by our house. A phone stuck out the window, recording. It wasn't Karen's car, but it had her fingerprints all over it. A few minutes later, a new email landed in my inbox. Community concern, unauthorized therapy equipment, and ADA compliance questions. No name, no signature, just a wall of text accusing us of potential safety risks to neighborhood children. It ended with, "Consider this a formal warning before fines are issued." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. My daughter's therapy setup was being called a public hazard on our own private property. They were trying to twist federal ADA protections into violations. It was absurd, but it was also chilling. That night, I sat with Julia on the porch. She was quiet, watching Maddie through the window as she colored. "It's not going to stop, is it?" she finally asked. "No," I said. "She's building something. A case, or a trail of fake violations to get the HOA board on her side." Julia's eyes welled up. "She's just a kid, Danny. How can someone hate a child for being different?" I didn't have an answer. I only knew this. Karen had declared a quiet, calculated war, and we'd seen only the beginning. The letter was her first shot, the confrontation on the sidewalk, her first battle, and her allies, those anonymous emails and recordings, proved she wasn't working alone anymore. She was laying groundwork, and something told me that whatever she had planned next would be far worse. Little did we know, she was already digging, and not just for violations. She was digging a hole. Literally. But no one, not me, not Julia, not even Maddie, could have imagined just how far she'd go. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control. And soon, it would become about survival. The days that followed the confrontation on our lawn were unusually quiet, too quiet. Karen had retreated, but it wasn't surrender. No, it felt more like the calm before a storm. The note stopped showing up. No fake violations, no HOA emails, no drive-bys with cell phones sticking out of car windows. At first, I thought maybe someone had finally gotten through to her. Maybe a neighbor had spoken up, or maybe the board had warned her to back off. But deep down, I knew better. Karen wasn't done. She was regrouping, planning. And then the small things started. It began with our trash bins. Every Tuesday, I rolled them out the night before like everyone else. But 3 weeks in a row, I'd find them dragged into the street by morning. On their sides, lids popped open, trash scattered like some animal had gotten in. But the neighborhood didn't have raccoons. And it only happened to our bins. Then our mailbox was damaged. It looked like someone had hit it with a bat or a crowbar, cracked the wooden post, warped the door so badly that it barely shut. I filed a report with the local post office and mentioned it in the neighborhood forum. Karen chimed in within the hour. So unfortunate. Perhaps it's time to invest in a sturdier design, one that matches HOA standards, of course. She ended the post with a winking emoji. Julia wanted to call the police. I told her we needed more than suspicion. We needed evidence. So I installed a motion-sensitive security camera above the garage. It fed directly to my phone and recorded automatically at night. The very first clip we got was at 2:14 a.m., a shadowy figure in a hoodie moving along the edge of our fence line. They didn't come close enough to trigger the floodlight, but they hovered, pacing back and forth for nearly 3 minutes before disappearing. I couldn't see their face, but the gait, the posture, it looked exactly like Karen. I brought the footage to the HOA meeting the next day, played it on my tablet for the board during open comments. Karen was sitting 2 seats away, flipping through her binder as if none of it concerned her. "This isn't proof," she said, without even looking up. "It's a silhouette. Could be anyone. You really shouldn't make wild accusations without evidence, Daniel." The board murmured in agreement, not because they believed her, but because they were afraid of her. Karen was the HOA in their eyes. She ran the meetings. She controlled the newsletters. She even approved the landscaping contracts. No one wanted to get on her bad side. Not even the president, because technically she was the president. It became clear we were on our own. After that meeting, the traps escalated. A landscaping company showed up at our door one morning, claiming we had ordered a full backyard clearing service. Julia answered, confused. "We never called anyone," she said, but they insisted. Said a woman named Janet Monroe had placed a request and paid the deposit. There's no Janet in our family. When I asked for the contact number on the order, the foreman hesitated. We were told not to call, just to do the job. Something about urgent compliance work requested by the HOA. I sent them away and called the company later. The number on file was unlisted, and the email address was generic jmonroe_services@something.com. It was a setup, Karen was trying to create chaos, fake orders, false bookings, traps designed to make us look irresponsible or mentally unstable. Gaslighting, basically, make us question reality. Or, better yet, make the neighborhood question us. Then came the threatening notes. They started appearing in Maddie's backpack. At first, we thought she was imagining things. She came home one day and quietly placed a folded sheet of notebook paper on the kitchen counter. I opened it. Inside, in blocky handwriting with mismatched ink, "People like you don't belong here. Go back where you came from." We were stunned. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Maddie looked down at her shoes. "It was in my backpack after I left it by the porch. We checked the cameras, nothing. Somehow, someone had slipped the note into her bag without being seen." A week later, it happened again. This time the message was darker. "You think you're special because of your legs. You're not. You're just a problem." Julia broke down after that one. She clutched Maddie and sobbed in the hallway, while I paced the living room, fists clenched. I had kept my cool for weeks, but this crossed every line. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was targeted psychological abuse against a child. I printed both notes, filed a police report, and brought them to the next HOA meeting. Karen didn't even flinch. "It's awful," she said with mock sympathy. "Really, just disgusting behavior. But unless you have proof it came from someone on this board, I'm afraid there's not much we can do. We're not responsible for children's personal belongings after all." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the dining room table and stared at the two notes, side by side, lit only by a small desk lamp. And that's when I saw it. The lowercase e in both messages had a faint upward curve. The G looped with an old-fashioned tail. I checked them against Karen's public posts in the HOA newsletter. The similarities were uncanny. I reached out to a friend from my days in cybersecurity who ran forensic handwriting analysis. He said while it wasn't court admissible without direct samples, the pattern alignment was more than just coincidence. Still, it wasn't enough. Maddie had begun to change. She was once joyful, outgoing, always the first to run or roll, outside in the morning. Now, she lingered at the door, glancing over her shoulder. She jumped at the sound of footsteps. She asked if we could move back to the old place, even though we had left that apartment years ago. That was the worst part. Watching her retreat into herself, the light dimming in her eyes. I tried to keep things normal. Set up weekend movie nights. Took her out to her favorite park across town. But the tension never left. Not really. And then, the final act of escalation, before everything exploded, came late one Friday evening. Maddie had gone out to water her flower patch by the back fence. Julia was cooking dinner. I was on a conference call when I heard Maddie scream. Not a yelp, not a cry, a scream of raw, unfiltered terror. I bolted outside. She was standing by the garden, frozen in place, hand trembling as she pointed to the ground. There, nestled between the flowers, was a metal animal trap, rusted, jagged, and armed. One of those spring-loaded contraptions with two steel jaws and a pressure plate in the middle. If she had stepped just 2 inches further, I disarmed it with a wrench and heavy gloves, then called the police. They searched the property. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. They filed it as a case of potential criminal mischief, but without hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I showed them the notes, the fake violations, the trash bin sabotage. Still not enough. Karen, when confronted, played her role perfectly. "Oh my God," she gasped. "That's horrifying. But this is why we need stricter neighborhood patrol. Maybe it's time we revisit the motion to install community surveillance." Unbelievable. She was using the very danger she created to push for more power. That night, I looked at my daughter, curled up next to Julia on the couch, her hands tucked beneath her chin like she was trying to hide from the world. And something inside me snapped, not in rage, but in resolve. I was done being quiet, done playing by the rules Karen twisted to serve herself. If the board wouldn't listen, if the police couldn't act without proof, then I would get the proof myself. I upgraded our cameras. I installed motion detectors around the yard. I began documenting everything, voice recordings, timestamps, every email and text from the HOA. I even set up a decoy therapy session in the front yard just to see if she'd take the bait. And just when I thought I had seen every despicable move she had to offer, just when I thought it couldn't possibly get worse, I discovered the hole. A narrow, carefully dug trench hidden behind our back fence, lined with loose stones and thin branches. A trap, right where Maddie walked every morning, right in the path of her daily routine, right where Karen could see from her upstairs window. But nothing prepared us for what she did next. Looking back, I realized the signs were there long before we knew what Karen was really planning. The subtle shifts in her routine, the way she hovered a little longer near our back fence, how her tone changed from condescending to calculated, less reactive, more quiet, focused. In those final days before it happened, something in her demeanor sharpened. She wasn't just being petty anymore. She was methodical, intentional. It began with her morning walks. For months, Karen had maintained a rigid routine, 6:45 a.m., rain or shine. She'd stride around the block in her pastel jogging set, leash in one hand, coffee thermos in the other, always moving in that exaggerated power walk, way that made her ponytail bounce like it was doing all the thinking. But then, without warning, her pattern changed. She started cutting her walk short, stopping outside our property's western edge, the area behind the rose bushes just beyond our tool shed. At first, I thought she was just being nosy again. Then I noticed it. She kept looking at the ground, staring, not glancing, noticing things, measuring. I remember one morning vividly. I was sipping coffee on the back patio before heading to work when I caught her just standing there, 2 steps off the sidewalk, eyes locked on the patch of grass near the back gate. It wasn't her usual theatrical glance. She was still, focused. Her lips moved like she was counting something under her breath. That patch of lawn had always been a bit softer. It dipped ever so slightly, the remnants of an old irrigation trench the previous owners never fully filled in. Maddie loved walking that route in the mornings. It was shaded, cooler, and led directly to the small flower patch she'd planted herself with Julia. The dirt was always a little loose, a little darker than the rest. Perfect for gardening, perfect for something else too. But at the time, I didn't think much of it. Karen staring at our yard? Pas force de course. She once filed a formal complaint because Julia painted flower pots lavender and not neutral beige. If I reported her every time she glared at a blade of grass, the police would have a dedicated parking spot on our curb. Still, something about her posture that day stuck with me. I even mentioned it to Julia. She was just standing there. I said, like plotting. Julia raised an eyebrow as she stirred her tea. Plotting what, HOA poetry slam? We laughed it off. We had to. If we didn't find some kind of humor in all this madness, it would have swallowed us whole. But the next day, Maddie came in from her morning walk with dirt on her shoes, thick, wet mud that clung like glue. "Where did you go, sweetheart?" I asked as I knelt to clean her soles. She pointed toward the back gate. I walked by the roses like always. But the ground felt weird today, like it was squishy. That word, squishy, rang in my ears. I went out after breakfast and checked. Sure enough, the soil in that same dip behind the fence was soft. Too soft. It had clearly been disturbed. The pattern didn't match natural settling. The rest of the yard was firm, dry from the summer heat, but that one patch, it looked like someone had recently turned the earth. Still, I chalked it up to poor drainage. Maybe a busted sprinkler valve from the last homeowner. I made a mental note to dig around it that weekend, but I never got the chance. 2 days later, I caught Karen in the alley behind our home. She was hunched low, next to our side fence, pretending to pick up her dog's waste. But her hand wasn't holding a bag. It was holding a measuring tape. She froze when she saw me watching from the upstairs window. Didn't even pretend to smile. Just stood up, turned sharply, and walked away. My chest tightened. I went outside that evening with a flashlight and scanned the fence line. There, just beside the rose bushes, I noticed a faint white chalk mark, a line about 3 feet long, perfectly straight. It was almost invisible during the day, but in the soft yellow beam of the flashlight, it glowed faintly like a boundary. I scraped at it. It didn't budge. That night, I told Julia what I saw. We agreed to move Maddie's morning routine closer to the front of the house just for a while, just until we figured out what Karen was doing. The next morning, I left early for work, but a storm was brewing in my mind. Something wasn't right, and my instincts, honed from years in data analysis, reading patterns, identifying anomalies, were screaming. I decided to take a detour home around lunchtime just to check. As I pulled into our street, I saw Karen standing beside a delivery truck. Two men in brown uniforms were unloading what looked like bags of garden soil, flat stone slabs, and a compact wooden crate. I parked at the end of the block and watched from behind tinted windows. She pointed to the very same spot behind our fence, the shaded dip just beyond Maddie's path. The workers glanced at her, shrugged, and began hauling the supplies into the alley. I couldn't hear them, but the way she motioned, directed, and nodded, I recognized it. It was the same way she managed HOA meetings, decisive, demanding, and without room for question. I wanted to confront her right there, but I needed more. That night, I checked the security footage. She'd slipped in through the side alley where the camera didn't reach. But a new alert from the garage sensor showed that motion had been triggered for exactly 11 seconds at 2:02 p.m. That's when I realized she was working in blind spots, deliberately avoiding the camera field, entering through weak spots in the fencing, waiting for times we weren't home. And then the next day, the soil was flat again, perfectly smooth, too perfect, not a leaf out of place. But when I stepped on it, the ground sank. It wasn't soft from overwatering. It had been hollowed out. I knelt and poked at the soil with a long screwdriver from the shed. For inches down, it hit nothing, just air. My hand shook as I tapped further. Still nothing. I dug faster, pulling back soil until the tip of the screwdriver caught on something wooden, solid, flat, almost like a cover. And that's when I knew. Karen had dug a pit, a shallow trap, disguised beneath a thin layer of soil, branches, and perfectly arranged stones that matched our garden border. It was expertly hidden. But the weight of a child, especially one using a walker, would be more than enough to break through. My knees buckled. My hands went numb. This wasn't some twisted metaphor anymore. This was real. A physical, mechanical trap set exactly along the path Maddie took every morning. Just like always. Right where she'd feel safe. Right where Karen could see her from her bedroom window. I filled it back in. Not completely. Just enough to stabilize it. Then I grabbed my phone, took pictures from every angle, and sent them to 3 people, Julia, my lawyer, and my old friend in law enforcement. But I didn't call Karen. Not yet, because now I finally had what I needed. Evidence, intent, and motive. Still, we couldn't take any chances. Julia stayed inside with Maddie the next day. I took off work and spent the whole morning circling the property, checking every inch of fencing, yard, and shed. But it was quiet until 4:07 p.m. The doorbell rang. I checked the camera. It was Karen, clipboard in hand, smiling. She didn't know yet. She thought her plan had gone off without a hitch. She thought we'd find Maddie screaming in that hole, covered in dirt, and maybe just then, we'd finally leave. But what she didn't know was that I was already digging, too. Digging into her past. Digging into the HOA bylaws she'd twisted to fit her power games. Digging into city permits, camera placements, and anonymous complaint patterns. Digging until I found the truth. And I had just begun. Because now, the trap wasn't set for my daughter anymore. It was set for her. It happened faster than I could scream. One moment, Maddie was laughing, her walker clicking softly over the garden path, and the next, the ground gave way beneath her like a trapdoor in a haunted house. She disappeared. Just like that. 1 second upright, the next gone. There was a sickening crack as her body slammed against the bottom of the pit. A sound I will never, ever forget. It echoed in my skull like a gunshot. Maddie! Julia shrieked before I could even process what had just happened. I was already sprinting across the yard, dropping the box of groceries I'd just brought in. The world blurred. The air thinned. My knees hit the dirt hard as I reached the pit, peering over the edge, and there she was, my baby, crumpled, motionless. Daddy, her voice was so faint, so small. Her little hands gripped the muddy dirt wall like she was trying to climb out, but her right leg, it wasn't right. Bent at an angle no leg should ever bend. Julia was sobbing, already on the phone with 911. I jumped in without thinking, my dress shirt catching on a jagged plank as I dropped. I scooped Maddie into my arms, trying to keep her head still, murmuring over and over, "It's okay, baby. I've got you. You're safe. I'm here." The pit was deeper than it looked, maybe 5.5 feet. At the bottom were sharp sticks, broken tiles, and scattered stones, placed exactly where someone would land if they fell. Someone wanted this to hurt. Someone planned this. And then I heard the voice. Well, Karen said casually, her silhouette casting a shadow over the pit like a specter. Maybe if you watched your kid a little better, she wouldn't be in places she doesn't belong. I didn't even realize I was shouting. My words were fire. My heart was war. Julia had to pull me back from climbing out and going at her. By the time the ambulance arrived, Karen was already fake crying in front of the HOA president, pretending she was so shaken by what happened. Said she just started a new garden project and had no idea anyone would walk over that part of the yard. Even with the EMTs lifting Maddie into the stretcher, her femur visibly broken, she still kept spinning it. Unfortunate accident. Poor supervision. Can't blame the HOA for this, but I had the photos. I had the messages. I had the footage. And when I showed the officer everything, the pit design, the layout, the hidden cover, the chalk lines, the delivery logs, his expression changed. His voice dropped. His pen paused. "This doesn't look like an accident," he said, flipping through the images. Still, Karen smirked. Even as Maddie was loaded into the ambulance, even as Julia screamed at her from the porch, even as the officers took her aside for questioning, she was confident. Because Karen had power. Friends on the HOA board. A cousin on city council. She knew how to manipulate the system, how to twist every narrative in her favor. And for a moment, just a flicker, I saw doubt on the officer's face. Like maybe she'd walk. Like maybe she'd do this again. Like maybe, just maybe, she'd win. But what Karen didn't know was, the moment Maddie hit that dirt, something in me snapped. Something quiet and surgical and ruthless. I wasn't just going to protect my family. I was going to destroy hers. Hospitals always smell like bleach and fear. I sat outside the operating room, my shirt still caked in dried mud and blood, clutching Maddie's backpack like it could hold me together. Julia sat beside me, silent for the first time in hours, her eyes swollen red, her fingers clenched white around a styrofoam coffee cup she never drank from. Inside, our daughter was being sedated for emergency surgery to stabilize her femur. Compound fracture, torn ligaments, mild concussion. The doctor said she'd walk again, eventually, but she'd be in a wheelchair for months, maybe longer. All because some HOA queen with a vendetta decided to dig a pit. I replayed everything, over and over. Karen standing at the edge of the hole, arms crossed like she was above it all. The way she smiled when the cops arrived, the way she made herself the victim, cried crocodile tears, and accused us of negligence. But I wasn't the same man I was yesterday. Something had changed. I didn't want peace anymore. I wanted justice. And if justice couldn't be found in court, I'd dig it up myself. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up our home security server. 3 cameras covered the side yard, Karen's so-called garden extension. It took an hour of scrubbing, but I found it. 4 days ago, Karen walked right into our property wearing gloves, dragging shovels, and measuring tape. She marked out a box with chalk, then started digging. She came back later with bricks and boards, then returned again and covered the entire thing with a thin sheet of grass-colored mesh. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was evil. I backed up every clip to multiple drives, uploaded it to the cloud, shared it with a friend who worked in digital forensics. Then I pulled Maddie's therapy logs, the HOA complaints, the fake citations Karen sent, the letters demanding we remove the eyesore walker ramp from our porch. I was building a case, not just to show what Karen had done, but to prove she'd been targeting us from day one. And then I called a friend, Detective Ray Holloway, a man I once helped during a massive data breach case in the city. When I told him what happened, he didn't hesitate. Email me everything, he said. I'll make some calls. Within 48 hours, a formal investigation was opened. Karen had no idea. She still walked around the neighborhood like royalty, gossiping about our family drama, pretending Maddie had tripped into a compost pile, but she didn't know the DA had the footage, didn't know her voice, captured on the video mic, had said, clear as day, "Let's see how you like this, you little brat." She was about to learn that the justice system might move slowly, but when it hits hard. But even as the law began turning, I knew something deeper had cracked. We weren't just dealing with a cruel woman, we were dealing with a structure that let her thrive. The HOA board ignored complaints. The neighborhood chat group muted our concerns. And Karen? She kept getting away with it. Until now. Because once Maddie came home from that hospital, broken leg and all, I sat beside her on the bed and whispered, "Sweetheart, I promise you, she's not going to hurt anyone else. Not ever again." 3 days after Maddie came home, I watched Karen's smile finally slip. It started small. An unmarked cruiser parked in front of her house. Two plainclothes officers walked up to her door and rang the bell. She answered like a queen greeting peasants until she saw the badges. Her face blanched. She tried to shut the door, but they were already inside. A voluntary conversation, they called it, but we both knew what it really was, a warning shot. I watched from my window, not with anger, but with focus. The kind of focus I hadn't felt since my early days in investigative journalism. Back then, I used to expose fraud rings, real estate scams, and white-collar criminals. Karen? She thought she was clever. But she was a cartoon villain in a world of professionals. The next morning, I submitted a formal motion to the HOA using the community charter. I demanded an emergency meeting to review Karen's actions under Article 12.4, endangerment and malicious negligence. The same rule she'd used to fine us for Maddie's wheelchair ramp, now turned against her. And here's the twist: the HOA board didn't want to do it. They'd protected her for years. But this time I attached the video files. I marked the most damning clips with timestamps and descriptions. And I CC'd every homeowner in the neighborhood. The group chat exploded. People who'd once ignored us now demanded answers. "You told us this was an accident?" She said the girl fell in her compost pit. "There are nails in that hole." This is insane. Karen tried to spin it again, claimed I had edited the footage, but I had already submitted the originals to the local DA's office. Chain of custody, verified timestamps, tamper-proof, checkmate. Then came the unexpected. Other neighbors started speaking out. Mrs. Delgado, for houses down, revealed that Karen once sent her a citation for illegal bird feeders. Greg, across the cul-de-sac, said Karen slashed his car tires after he voted against her fence proposal. Even retired Colonel Briggs admitted she had filed a complaint against his service dog. Karen wasn't just cruel, she was systematic. So we formed a coalition, quietly, strategically. A week later, at the emergency HOA meeting, we voted. Karen was removed from the board. Not only that, we filed a civil suit for targeted harassment and child endangerment. 28 homeowners joined. It became local news. And just like that, her kingdom began to collapse. But I didn't gloat. Instead, I sat next to Maddie, helping her with her physical therapy, whispering encouragement with every wince and every stretch. She smiled again. She slept through the night again. And that was all the victory I needed for now. The courtroom was silent as the security footage played. Karen sat stiff in her chair, arms folded tight, lips pressed into a thin white line. On the screen, the jury and judge watched her walk across my yard with a shovel, kneel at the edge of the grass, and carefully unroll the mesh cover over the pit she had dug. "Let's see how you like this, you little brat." Her voice echoed through the speakers. The jury didn't flinch. They didn't need to. Every detail was crystal clear. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't poor planning. It was premeditated cruelty, set in motion by a woman who thought no one would ever hold her accountable. When the footage ended, my attorney rose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, calm but cutting, "we're not here because a child fell into a hole. We're here because an adult built that hole for that child." And then she lied. And then she blamed the victim. It took less than 4 hours for the verdict to come back, guilty. Karen was fined heavily for child endangerment, slapped with a restraining order, and sentenced to 6 months of house arrest. Her HOA privileges were revoked permanently. Her reputation? Ruined. But honestly, none of that mattered to me as much as what happened after. The neighborhood changed. The ramp Karen once fought so hard to have removed, the HOA approved funding for permanent accessibility upgrades throughout the entire community. Maddie's injury sparked a movement. Families came together, neighbors formed bonds, and people started looking out for each other instead of hiding behind bylaws and gossip. Maddie? She's healing. The cast came off. The wheelchair days are behind her now. I still remember the first time she walked from the living room to the kitchen, on her own, without help, wobbling but determined. She looked up at me and said, "She didn't win, Daddy." And she was right. Karen didn't win. She lost everything the moment she underestimated the strength of the quiet family next door, the one she thought she could bully, trap, and break. But most of all, she underestimated the one thing she could never control: love. Love for a daughter. Love that refuses to be intimidated. Love that fights back and wins. It's been nearly a year since Karen was found guilty. Her house sits quiet now, for sale sign on the lawn. The same neighbors who once waved to her now walk past without a glance. She's become a ghost in her own kingdom. And yet, we're not bitter. Not really, because the real story here isn't just about revenge. It's about resilience. It's about a girl who got back up literally. It's about a community that chose empathy over fear, and a father who refused to let his daughter grow up believing cruelty goes unpunished. We've built something stronger now. Not just a ramp or a lawsuit, but trust. Trust that even when evil wears a polite smile and a homeowner badge, it can be defeated. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can dig all the traps you want. But when you're standing on hate, you're already in the hole. Thanks for watching. If this story hit you hard, if you believe in standing up for what's right even when it's not easy, then subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with a Karen in your life, or if you've fought back against injustice in your own way. Turn on notifications, because we've got more powerful real-life stories coming about grit, justice, and the moments that define who we are. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never let hate win.